Over my last few playthroughs of Satisfactory, I have built tons of factories. From circular builds like this one and this one, to experimental builds set underground, or ones that use AI as inspiration. So today I'm going to show you how to go from box factories like this one here, to something a little bit more creative in about 10 easy tips so anyone should be able to replicate something like this quite easily. So with that in mind, let's jump straight into it. The first thing that I want to talk about is wall width and depth. So here we have a single line of walls with a little window in it. Very nice, but it's very flat. There is no definition at all from this. So the way that we counter this is by adding extra depth to a wall. Now please forgive me for this tutorial. I am going to be flying and also using creative mode just for the ease of explaining and showing you this. But the first way in which we add depth is by, rather than having a single wall as you can see here, we play around with having a wall that is 1 to 2 foundations deep. And what this does is it gives us a lot more to play about with. From here we will need to change the textures because that gives us more details to look at. It changes the design of the build. So we can do this with using something like coated concrete, we could use asphalt, we could use concrete. Generally speaking, I play around with the concrete and also the coated one, which we'll do in a second. And so we can really easily play around with depth by building a wall that is 2 foundations wide. So imagine this whole thing is the wall, and we're going to have the center section. We're going to change this to maybe a half foundation, and we're just going to play around with different levels here. We can do this with walls, we could do this with windows, we could add actual sections of the wall to this as well, and then we could also maybe add pillars. And just having this extra definition really changes the feel to the build. And then once you're happy with a given wall, maybe you can add a little top section. And here you have something slightly different that just looks a little bit nicer. We could play around with the textures on the wall, like I mentioned earlier, the coating. And what you can also do is play around with signs, using signs for walls as well. Like so. One of my favorite things to do is just to keep this plain, and we'll remove any text, we'll remove the icon, turn this to glossy and turn off the emission, and then you get this black mirrored wall which looks really nice. And it doesn't stop here, because you could also play around with the color of various parts. Notice how adding a dark color against the white here really adds to the contrast of the build. Or we could change this to, say, this beautiful copper metallic texture. But the big thing to take away here is that by giving yourself extra space to play around with the build, giving yourself 1 foundation or 2 foundations width for the walls, you can really play around with the depth and remove that flat look. And this can actually be really useful for later on when we talk about lighting. Here is another quick design that I came up with, and this particular one is actually done by clipping the angled frame windows. Rather than having them central, I've clipped them into this section, which gives it this lovely kind of V shape going down towards the center from these angled supports. And then once again, we've played around with the depth, the pillars, the single wall as well. All of that is combined to create these quite industrial heavy looking structures, along with the walls just looking generally flat. If you don't add more depth to them, they look a bit boring, whether that's the metal wall here or the concrete and metal walls. So one thing you should try and play around with once you're more comfortable with the game is playing about with how you create a wall. Don't stick to the base items. I've already mentioned how I like playing around with using signs to create this glossy black finish, but along with using signs, you can also use things like beams. As shown here, this gives us a diagonal wall effect, and on top of this, if you really wanted to play about with it, we could actually go from something like this in diagonal mode, then hold Control and use the mouse wheel to change the angle of the wall. And that can be another way to really get different designs out of the beam piece. One thing that I like to do with the beams is to play around with lighting. And you'll see me play around with this a lot. If I use diagonals, I quite often have some kind of underlighting beneath it, just to make it pop a little bit. Another thing that's often overlooked is just the use of pillars in general. These can add a really nice texture to your build by breaking up in vertical lines, as you can see here. And you can really easily play around with these because of the way that they interact with beams. So for example, if we place these down here, we can then use the beams to direct where we want the pillars to go, just by bringing them across in the diagonal mode. And then these will snap to the end of the pillar. And so you can have a lot of fun playing around with these if you want to use them as diagonal supports. But obviously you need to play around to get the right positioning. Returning back to the flat walls, there's another thing that I want to talk about, and that is layering walls. So this is something that I've started to use more and more in my builds, because we have the ability to nudge items now by pressing H once we've got the hologram out, and then using the arrow keys, we can play around with their positioning. And if we use Control, I should show you from above. This is without Control. With Control, we have smaller incremental changes to the positioning. This allows us to really play around with layering walls, because we could, as you can see here, layer the walls one on top or one in front of the other to create different textures. And that could be really useful for adding depth when you don't have much space. So for example, here we've just added an inverted ramp wall. By holding Control and then using the arrow key, we've brought the inverted ramp just in front of that. And using shadows and lighting can really elevate your design skills. Obviously, we're just playing around here with lots of different shapes, but here in this section, if we hadn't used a slightly different color, you can't really tell the difference so much. So when it comes to things like this, it can often be really beneficial to play around with the color, as it adds more contrast to the build. One thing that you may have seen in my storage facility is I use the ramped inverted walls and the ramped walls to create these diagonal lines in front of a sign. In fact, I'll jump to that really quickly for you. Here we are. You can see how I've done it. And all I've done is nudged and layered these walls in front of the signs to get this really nice design. If you choose to use double the width foundations for your walls, you can add a lot of depth by playing around with the different foundation types, as you can see here with the ramped foundations. We've also played around with the curved foundations and the different textures here. This works particularly well on larger builds, and then for smaller builds we can just use our plain walls. As you can see here, all I've done is add a basic wall, 1 meter variance, and then added one beneath and then done another section. You don't have to do this. You could have these as 2 single lines. You could maybe do some light signs in the center, or you could play around with a different color or texture foundation. So for example, if we want to change the color or the texture type, the metallic type, you can see we've got this really nice little, almost like gradient from the copper to the carbon metal. And that's something that anyone can do with a single wall and then something like a half foundation. These are the full ones, but you can easily do this with a half foundation if you don't have that much space. You can also play around with different pieces of foundation. So this is us mixing the outer corners with other outer corners flipped the other way. And so it's created I don't know the name of the shape, this kind of curved rectangle. But then by changing the texture from a carbon to the copper, you can get a really nice design from it, and something that's very different to most other factories that you'll see on Discord or in other creators' videos. I also really like how the copper with the coated foundation almost looks like a dark mahogany wood. Moving on, I wanted to talk about roofing. Quite often with the roofs, I struggle to make them look nice, but a few tips that I use quite often that have a good finish, in my opinion, is the use of the beams to border the build. Unfortunately, if you place them on the end, they overhang, and that can sometimes just look a little clunky for the design. So what I actually do is I'll place down the outer section, then I'll press H, and from here I nudge it once again, just a half increment. So you're holding control to do that. It's not the large one, it's the half increment into the build, so that it's actually ever so slightly inside. Notice the difference here. And so you will see that on the builds that we've just done right at the end. Another thing that you can do, and I often do, is I play around with the basic walls. I create this grid. This is fantastic if you're using blueprints. All of this is really good as a blueprint. So I'll just show you here. This is the slotted wall, and you can create a blueprint and just snap them together really easily. But the great thing about this is it gives you a lot of light and shadow in your build, and having that contrast can really make the inner section of your factories really pop. And then finally, what I like to add occasionally is once again the same thing that we've done with the signed walls. We put a sign on top, and you can do this really easily just by holding control. If you hold control, it will place flat against the foundation that you're placing on. Next, I wanted to talk about fencing, which is often used just to border your builds, and it can look quite nice. However, custom fencing and barriers look even better in my opinion. So we've got a few that I'm going to show you now. The first one, and by far the easiest, is a single 1 meter wall with a beam across it. So we can just place it here, and then we grab our beam and we run it, and then you make sure that the two colors are slightly different. For example, there, that one's off-white, which is nice enough, and I think this is an easy one to do. However, if you want to be a little bit more adventurous, we have this here. This has a more darker industrial security fence kind of feel with these laser-like lights popping up. This is really easily done. I'm going to show you here. What we will do is we'll place a pillar, and then holding control, we're going to run this along the side so that it's just popping out along the bottom. And then from here, you're going to grab your fence and zoop mode, run it across. From here, we're going to add the carbon finish to the bottom section, and you can do carbon or some kind of dark looking color. You can do dark gray. Then we have our signs. Now these can be placed directly onto the little joints here. And then all you're going to do with this is remove the icon so that you have the orange color and then the black border. And then we're going to invert this. So we're turning the black border to like a deep red, and then we're going to turn the orange one to a black. And then at this point we can increase the emission. You can turn it glossy if you want, and from here we can copy and paste these. And there you go, you have a security fence for your outpost or factory. And then this one you may have seen used in my Let's Play series or in several videos. I've shown it off a couple of times. This is just a barrier with a sign inside it. To get the lighting, you need to turn the emission strength up to 3. And then have the background the color that you want the light to be. The issue with this one is that if we place down a sign and then our barrier, it's not in the right position. So the way that you get around this is you need to place a sign like we've done here, and then to the side of it, you want to snap it halfway down like so. Then you can copy and paste the signs and add your barrier. And with the barrier you can zoom them, makes them nice and easy to do. All of these are particularly easy if you turn them into blueprints, so I do highly recommend doing that. And then we have the next one. This one's a little bit more difficult because we are using these big wall frames, but I really like the look of these. So as you can see here, we have the sign just below, and they're really easy to do. The way that we do this, we're going to have to place a single 1 meter foundation. And then above this, we're going to place our frame wall. Now, when you're placing the frame wall, it has 2 snapping points. You can use the mouse wheel to put it on the outside or the inside. I prefer mine on the outside. And we're going to zoom down. Bear in mind that underneath here, you're going to have at least 3 meters deep of foundations, otherwise it's going to pop through to the floor below. From here we have the little railing, and then the next thing that you need to do is just grab your signs. We're just going to place them directly on the floor beneath them, and you'll see it's the perfect position. And then you just need to copy and paste the sign, and it looks pretty awesome. If you don't like these little struts here, you can also get rid of that. And again, I think that looks pretty cool. The easiest way to change a box is to change the overall look of the shape. And so here we have what originally was going to be, in fact, I'll show you. Originally, this was going to be a single straight section to like the wall of the box. What we've done here is really simple. We've placed 2 foundations in the front, then got rid of the ones behind, with the exception of the 2 corners. These are going to be the points that we connect the walls together, and same on this side as well. For this, you are going to want your beam. You're going to put it in freeform. Find the middle part and drag this across to the middle section corner in front. And we're going to do the same on the other side. And this is a great way to merge any foundations together. If you're struggling, this is the solution to pretty much all of your issues when merging onto grids. So from here, we're going to grab our foundation and place it on the end of the beam so that it snaps like this. Then we can press H to lock it in position. That's why it's not moving. And then we use the arrow keys to move it 4 across and then 4 up. We can then do the same on the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And we can place another just in between to close it off. And then if you delete this barrier, you'll beam, sorry, you can see how flush the edges are. So this is a really easy way to make or change the shape of your build. so that it stands out from the crowd. Like so. And then here we've taken a leaf out of our book over there with changing the depth by using a 1 meter deep foundation for the walls. We're going to go with the complete 4 meter foundation for the sides here. And then the next thing, I'm going to place the wall in the middle. We need to do the control nudge to get it the halfway point in this circumstance. Maybe to there. And then we'll bring the other one next to that. And we can zoot this up, filling in the wall. This could be a window if you want. In fact, we'll do a window on the other side. Gonna nudge it halfway. There we are. And then from here, we can grab our window piece. Unfortunately, you will get the little bar in the middle. You could remove this, or hide it, I should say, with a beam if you want. Same with if you're not too keen on the joint. If you want to make them more prominent, you can use a beam. But this is a really easy way to add a little bit of shape to your builds. So now that we've done it on either side, we can change the materials maybe on the bottom. So I like to use something like asphalt to break up the design. And then from here, if you want, you can use something like an angled ramp along the side. So we're just going to snap it under there, and it nicely blends together. Go on the other side. And obviously you can experiment and do this as you prefer. If you had these as full foundations, this could look quite nice as well. You could play around with the stair foundations. Just make sure to change the material as you see necessary. And there you go, that's already looking much better. Obviously you can then play around with the pillars if you'd like. You can play around with adding some signs as lighting, as we've done previously, and so on. A really easy way to change the shape of your build. And then what I would do with the ceiling, I'd probably keep this flat and then start the ceiling on the next part, as it can be difficult to get the ceiling right when you're playing around with merging shapes. Regardless, the next tip is going to be really useful when it comes to making your builds pop. So here we have a plain wall and it looks very flat. Equally, if we change the time of day, if you're wondering, I'm using Skybox UI for this. It allows me to change the time of day as I see fit. It just looks a bit boring as a plain wall. That is where we can play around with lighting. And so with Lumen enabled, you can really play around with how the light affects your builds and play around with using light and also shadows to make them pop a little bit more. In this circumstance, what I've done is I've placed a single wall in the back, and then at the top I have, in fact I'll show you, I'll run it here. So from here we have our wall, 3 high, and then I'm going to grab a 4 meter foundation and we're going to run it up vertically, just so that we have one on top. Then using the trick that I mentioned earlier, hold Control, you can place the sign against the ceiling without any issues, and we're just going to snap that half the way through, like so. Then I'm going to use the same trick to light these up. Remember, turn the emission up and then change the color as you see fit. And then for this one, we're actually talking specifically about down lighting. This is lighting that's lit from above and then down facing. And as you can see here, as we've left it, we've got light flooding down here. And as with having a normal plain wall, if you just leave it as is, it's a bit boring. And this is where playing with shadow comes in. So for this, we're going to go back to the tip about layering our walls. So I've locked this in place. I'm just going to bring it up to the side and nudge it in place so it's skirting the light here. And already it looks a fair bit better. You can see how it's slightly darker along the bottom. From here, we're going to add, and you can play around with this any way you want. If you wanted to, you could do things with adding your walls so that they're gradually getting closer. If you wanted, you see you've got a little bit of light there shining through, or you could play around using some kind of dog teeth. I'm actually going to get rid of all of these and we're going to go back to our pillars. I'm going to use a small pillar, and then from here you can run it through. You can do it from the bottom up. Probably going to be the better solution for us. I'm going to place it halfway into these foundations. And then for the T design that I've shown you, we go from the other side through, so we only have this small section, and then we do the same on the other side. You may need to hold the control while placing these to get them in the right location, and there you can see we've got a little tip coming through here. If you want to do the other side as well, you'll have to delete the section, then go from the other side and then replace it. It's a little bit finicky in that respect, but there you are, downlighting. The other type of lighting that I'd recommend, other than just placing the lights directly onto the build, as you've seen me do, such as something like this, and obviously you can change the light. That still looks pretty cool, let's be honest. Just highlighting one section. Oh, I might use that. The other thing that you can do is up lighting. So it's the opposite to down lighting, and it lights up. For this, I particularly like to have a skirt around the outside so you can't actually see the lighting, and it just lights upwards. You can play about with light being shown only on the lower sections, and you can see how you can use that shadow as well as the light to really make parts of your build stand out. And Bob's your uncle, and you can also play around with different colors. I'm particularly fond of mixing like an orange and a yellow at the moment, quite a vibrant orange, an orange and a blue, sorry. So play around with it, have fun. Speaking of which, that's the next tip. The game is about having fun. Play around with things, experiment, and see what you come up with. Don't be afraid to break things and rebuild them if it's not what you're looking for. Another thing that you can do is play with the theme of builds. So for example, if we go to my Let's Play series, I've actually decided to play around with giving each biome a theme, and we've only worked on this first biome so far. I will be playing around with different ideas as we get further into the game, but here in the grassy fields, you can see how we're playing around with the different greys, whites, but then we're using copper as a focal texture for this. We're also playing around with the pillars as well to really add depth to the builds, and all of the builds here play around with that theme, so everything works quite well together. But each facility here plays around with those pieces to make it all blend together quite well as part of a section of the map. That doesn't mean that we can't play around with the shape. As you can see, we're playing with different ideas for shapes here, but it does still bring everything together. I've even done the same with my rail. In fact, what I'll probably do is keep this as the main rail design for the majority of the map, but then in each of the individual biomes we'll have dedicated styles as well, something a little bit different. And then the last tip would be to find inspiration in what you're building. For example, when I first started playing the game, I looked at builds around my cities that I were in as inspiration for my builds. And your inspiration doesn't have to come from seeing things in real life. You can take it from things that you've seen on Reddit or from other content creators. Or for that matter, you could do what I did in the very last episode of my Let's Play series, where I used AI prompts to come up with ideas for my factories. And that was an incredible experience because I really had to play around with various ideas to try and make them work in Satisfactory, such as this foundry room here, or my steel pipeline here. By the way, if you are intrigued about how I built all of this, and there's definitely a lot to take in, then I will leave a link to this video in the pinned card at the end of the video. But guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit the thumbs up, and if you want to see more, don't forget to subscribe and let me know what you'd like me to cover next when it comes to design elements in your factories. But as always, special thanks does go to all of our amazing supporters on Patreon, most notably our Lunar Eclipse patrons, Firefless, The Calamity, Ben, Star, and Seeker Kala, as well as our Blood Moon of the day, which today is the Salchan Husky. Until next time, as always, ciao for now.